Jimmy Stewart's hand froze on the bomb release lever. Through the plexiglass nose of the B-24 Liberator, 22,000 feet above the German countryside, he could see them clearly. Children, running across the courtyard of what was supposed to be a munitions factory. But those weren't workers down there. Those were families, and in 30 seconds, his bombs would turn that place into a graveyard. The radio crackled in his headset. "Able Baker 6, you are cleared hot. Drop on my mark." Colonel Morrison's voice was calm, routine. Just another Tuesday night over occupied Europe. March 15, 1944. Mission number 47 for the 445th Bomb Group. Target, German Industrial Complex, grid reference Charlie 7. Estimated enemy casualties, acceptable losses. But Jimmy Stewart had spent the last 3 years learning that there was nothing acceptable about loss, nothing routine about death. And right now, staring down at those tiny figures scurrying for cover, he was about to make a decision that would haunt him for the next 50 years. The wind at altitude was fierce that night. Jimmy could feel the big bomber shuddering against the crosswinds. Ice crystals formed on his oxygen mask. His bombardier, Lieutenant Danny Walsh from Chicago, was hunched over his Norden bomb site, making final calculations. Behind him, 8 other young men who trusted him to bring them home alive. They'd been in the air for 3 hours already. Taken off from Tibbenham Airfield in the early evening darkness, formed up with the rest of the squadron, and droned eastward across the channel. The usual pre-mission briefing had been straightforward. Intelligence said the target was a ball-bearing factory. Critical war production. Take it out, cripple German manufacturing capacity. Simple, clean, military. But nothing was simple anymore. Not after what Jimmy had seen in the past year. Not after Dresden. 3 weeks earlier, Jimmy Stewart had been part of the largest bombing raid in European history. He'd watched entire city blocks disappear in walls of fire. He'd flown through smoke columns that rose 3 miles into the sky. When they landed back at base, the intelligence officers had congratulated them. "Great success, gentlemen. Enemy infrastructure severely damaged." That night, Jimmy couldn't sleep. He kept thinking about the fires, about the families trapped in their homes, about children who looked like his nephew back in Indiana, running through streets that had become furnaces. But you didn't talk about things like that. Not in wartime. Not when you had a job to do. 30 seconds to target, Danny called out. His voice was steady, professional. They'd done this drill 46 times before. Danny was good at his job, maybe too good. Jimmy looked down again. The courtyard was clearing now, but he could still make out small figures pressed against the walls of nearby buildings. A woman holding something in her arms, probably a baby. 20 seconds. The bomber flew straight and level. At this altitude, this speed, there was no changing course now. The mission parameters were locked in. The target was below. The orders were clear. But here's what they don't tell you about war. They don't tell you about the moments when everything slows down and you have to choose between following orders and following your conscience. They don't tell you about the weight of that lever in your hand, or how a split-second decision can carry the weight of a lifetime. 10 seconds. Bomb bay doors open. The aircraft shuddered as the bay doors split apart beneath them. Cold air rushed up through the openings. Jimmy could feel the bomber lift slightly as wind caught the open doors. 5 seconds. Jimmy Stewart's thumb hovered over the release button. One push. That's all it would take. One small movement of his right thumb and 2 tons of high explosives would drop into the darkness below. The mission would be complete. The intelligence reports would be filed. Another successful raid against German war production. But those weren't German soldiers down there. Those were people. Mark, bombs away. Jimmy's hand moved, but not the way it was supposed to. Instead of pressing the release, he pulled back hard on the controls. The B-24 lurched upward, climbing away from the target. The sudden change in altitude threw everyone forward in their seats. "What the hell, Jimmy?" Danny's voice cut through the intercom. "We missed the target." "Engine trouble," Jimmy called back, his voice steady despite his racing heart. "Had to pull up. Safety issue." It was a lie. The engines were running perfectly. But it was the kind of lie that could save lives and end careers all at the same time. But wait, you need to understand something here. Something that changes everything about what Jimmy Stewart did that night. Because this wasn't just about disobeying orders. This wasn't just about making a choice between duty and conscience. This was about something else entirely. Something that Jimmy wouldn't fully understand until 23 years later, when a letter arrived at his home in Beverly Hills. A letter that would make him realize that sometimes the right choice feels wrong for decades, and sometimes the wrong choice saves more lives than the right one ever could. But we're getting ahead of ourselves. Right now it's March 15, 1944, and Jimmy Stewart has just committed what the military would call dereliction of duty, what his crew would call mechanical failure, and what he would call the longest 30 seconds of his life. The bomber continued climbing, carrying its full load of bombs away from the target. Below them, the German industrial complex sat in darkness, untouched. Workers and families who had been preparing for death went back to their evening routines, never knowing how close they'd come to disaster. "Should we circle back?" Danny asked over the intercom. Standard procedure after mechanical failure was to attempt a second run once the problem was resolved. Jimmy looked at his instrument panel. Every gauge was normal. Every system was functioning perfectly. There was no mechanical problem to resolve. "Negative," he replied. "Issue's too serious. We're heading for secondary target." The secondary target was an empty field 15 miles east. Intelligence had designated it as an alternate drop zone for exactly these situations. No strategic value, no casualties, just a place to dump ordnance and head home. For the next 20 minutes, none of Jimmy's crew said a word. They all knew the engines sounded fine. They all knew the instruments looked normal. But they also knew Jimmy Stewart was the kind of pilot who'd brought them through 46 missions without losing a single crew member. If Jimmy said they had a problem, then they had a problem. When they reached the empty field, Jimmy pressed the release button. 2 tons of bombs fell harmlessly into German farmland, probably killed a few rabbits and made some impressive craters. But that's all. Able Baker 6, this is home base. Report mission status. Jimmy picked up his radio microphone. In a few seconds, he would have to explain to Colonel Morrison why they'd missed their target. He would have to file a report detailing the mechanical failure that never happened. He would have to look his commanding officer in the eye and lie about engine trouble. But here's the thing about Jimmy Stewart that nobody understood. Not his crew, not his commanders, not even Jimmy himself at the time. He wasn't the kind of man who could live with killing children, even in wartime, even under orders, even when everyone expected him to. He'd grown up in Indiana, son of a hardware store owner who'd taught him that some things were more important than rules, some things were more important than orders, and some things were more important than war. Home base, this is Able Baker 6, mission completed, secondary target destroyed due to mechanical issues with primary approach, another lie. But this one would go into the official records. This one would become part of Jimmy Stewart's war record. 47 missions, perfect safety record, no unnecessary casualties. What the records wouldn't show was the cost of that perfect record. What they wouldn't show was the weight that Jimmy Stewart carried every time he climbed into that cockpit. The weight of choosing conscience over duty. The weight of knowing that his mechanical failures were keeping him alive inside while making him look like a hero outside. The flight back to Debenham took 2 hours. Jimmy flew in silence, watching the English countryside appear in the darkness below. Behind him, his crew cleaned their guns and ran through post-mission checklists, routine procedures after another successful bombing run. But success felt different when you measured it in lives saved instead of targets destroyed. When they landed, Colonel Morrison was waiting on the tarmac. He was a good officer, fair, direct, and smart enough to know when his pilots were struggling. He'd noticed that Jimmy's missions always seemed to have unusual numbers of mechanical problems, problems that somehow never showed up during maintenance inspections. "Walk with me, Stewart," Morrison said after the crew had been debriefed. They walked across the airfield in silence, past the rows of B-24s being refueled and rearmed for tomorrow's missions, past the maintenance crews working through the night to keep the bombers flying, past the communications hut where intelligence officers were already planning the next day's targets. Finally, Morrison stopped next to Jimmy's aircraft. He looked up at the big bomber, then back at Jimmy. "Funny thing about mechanical problems," Morrison said quietly. "They tend to show up in the maintenance logs. Oil pressure issues, engine temperature problems, electrical faults, all the things that could cause a pilot to abort a mission." Jimmy didn't respond. He knew where this conversation was heading. "But your bird always checks out perfect after these incidents. Every system normal, every component functioning exactly as designed." Morrison lit a cigarette, cupping the flame against the wind. In the brief flare of light, Jimmy could see the exhaustion in his commander's eyes, the weight of sending young men into combat, night after night, the burden of planning missions that would kill people on both sides. "You know what I think, Stewart?" Morrison took a long drag on his cigarette. "I think you've got the best maintained aircraft in this squadron. I think your crew trusts you more than any other pilot on this base. And I think you've got the kind of conscience that's going to get you court-martialed if you're not careful." There it was. The truth. spoken quietly in the darkness between two men who understood the impossible choices that war demanded. "Sir, I can explain." Morrison held up his hand. Don't explain anything. Don't admit anything. Don't put either of us in a position where I have to write a report that ends your career." They stood in silence for a moment. Around them, the base continued its nighttime preparations. Mechanics working by flashlight, radio operators monitoring German frequencies, intelligence officers studying reconnaissance photos of tomorrow's targets. "You know what the hardest part of this job is, Stewart?" Morrison flicked his cigarette away. "It's not the planning. It's not the logistics. It's not even watching good men die in bad weather." He turned to look directly at Jimmy. "The hardest part is knowing that we're asking 20-year-old kids to make choices that 50-year-old generals wouldn't want to make. We're asking them to drop bombs on people they've never met, in places they can't pronounce, for reasons they don't fully understand." Morrison started walking back toward the operations building. "But here's what I've learned in 2 years of running bombing missions. Sometimes the best pilots aren't the ones who follow orders perfectly. Sometimes they're the ones who know when not to follow them." He stopped and looked back at Jimmy. "Just make sure your mechanical problems don't become a pattern, Stewart, and make sure whatever you're carrying inside doesn't get heavy enough to bring down your plane." Jimmy watched his commanding officer disappear into the darkness. Then he stood alone next to his bomber, looking up at the aircraft that had become both his salvation and his burden. 47 missions, 0 crew casualties, perfect mechanical record on paper, and a secret that was eating him alive from the inside. But this is where the story takes a turn that Jimmy Stewart never saw coming. Because 23 years later, long after the war had ended, long after he'd returned to Hollywood and become America's favorite leading man, a letter would arrive that would change everything he thought he knew about that night over Germany. The letter came on a Tuesday morning in 1967. Jimmy was at his Beverly Hills home, reading the newspaper and drinking coffee like he did every morning. His war service was ancient history by then. He'd made dozens of movies, won awards, married the love of his life. The weight of those wartime decisions had faded into the background of a successful peacetime life. But then his housekeeper handed him an envelope with foreign postage. The return address was somewhere in Germany, a town he didn't recognize. Inside was a letter written in careful English, translated from German by someone who was clearly struggling with the language. But the message was clear. "Dear Mr. Stewart, my name is Klaus Weber. I am writing to you because my father told me you were the American pilot who saved our lives on March 15, 1944. Jimmy's coffee cup stopped halfway to his lips. He set it down carefully, his hand suddenly unsteady. The letter continued. "My father was night watchman at the industrial complex in our town. He saw your aircraft approach the target that night. He saw the bomb bay doors open. He gathered all the families from the worker housing and moved them to the shelter in the basement of the main building." Jimmy felt something cold settle in his stomach. The main building, that had been the primary target. If his bombs had hit where they were supposed to hit, when your aircraft pulled away without dropping its bombs, my father knew that the American pilot had seen the families below. He said the pilot had chosen mercy over orders. The letter explained that Klaus Weber was now a doctor. He had 3 children and 5 grandchildren. His father had lived to be 86 years old. The other families in the shelter that night had gone on to rebuild their lives, raise children, contribute to their community, all because Jimmy Stewart had pulled back on his controls instead of pressing a button. But here's the part that broke Jimmy's heart and healed it at the same time. The part that made him understand that some decisions echo through generations in ways you never expect. "Mr. Stewart, I wanted you to know that your choice that night saved 17 families, 68 people total, including 12 children under the age of 10. Today those children have become parents and grandparents. The lives you saved that night have become more than 200 lives today. 200 lives. From one moment of choosing conscience over orders." Jimmy Stewart sat in his Beverly Hills living room holding a letter from a German doctor, finally understanding the true cost of the choice he'd made 23 years earlier. Not the cost to his military career or his service record. The cost to his soul, which had been carrying the weight of potential court-martial for 2 decades. He'd spent 23 years wondering if he'd done the right thing. 23 years carrying the secret of his mechanical failures. 23 years believing that choosing mercy over duty had made him less of a soldier. But Klaus Weber's letter made it clear that Jimmy Stewart had been exactly the kind of soldier the world needed. The kind who understood that sometimes the most courageous thing a warrior can do is refuse to fight. The letter ended with a simple request. "If you ever visit Germany, please come to our town. There is a memorial garden here, planted in honor of the American pilot who chose life over orders. We would be honored to show it to you." Jimmy Stewart never made that trip to Germany, but he kept Klaus Weber's letter in his desk drawer for the rest of his life. And sometimes, when the weight of Hollywood expectations or the pressures of being America's everyman got too heavy, he would take out that letter and remember the night he chose conscience over duty. Remember the night he learned that sometimes the right choice feels wrong for decades, until a letter arrives to tell you that your moment of mercy saved 200 lives. The war ended 14 months after that night over Germany. Jimmy Stewart completed 27 more missions without ever facing another situation like the one on March 15, 1944. His service record showed mechanical failures on 7 different missions, but his crew never lost confidence in their pilot or their aircraft. Years later, when Jimmy was asked about his war service, he always focused on his crew, the young men who'd trusted him to bring them home safely. He never mentioned the nights when mechanical problems had saved German lives. He never talked about the weight of choosing mercy in wartime. But those who served with him remember a different story. They remember a pilot who somehow always managed to find alternatives to unnecessary killing. A commander who brought his crew through 50 missions without losing anyone, American or German. They remember Jimmy Stewart as the kind of officer who understood that the real victory in war isn't destroying your enemy. It's preserving your humanity while doing what has to be done. And sometimes what has to be done is pulling back on the controls when your conscience tells you that following orders would cost you something more valuable than your military career. Sometimes what has to be done is choosing to be the kind of person who can live with himself after the shooting stops. That's the real story of Jimmy Stewart's war service. Not the medals or the commendations. Not the perfect safety record or the successful missions. The real story is about a hardware store owner's son from Indiana who learned that sometimes the most heroic thing you can do is refuse to be a hero. So the next time you watch Jimmy Stewart in It's a Wonderful Life, or Mr. Smith Goes to Washington, or any of the movies that made him America's conscience on screen, remember that his greatest performance wasn't in Hollywood. It was in the cockpit of a B-24 bomber, 22,000 feet above Germany, when he chose mercy over orders and saved 200 lives with the movement of his hand. That's the Jimmy Stewart the world never saw. The one who understood that real courage isn't about following orders perfectly. It's about knowing when to break them for something more important than victory. It's about having the strength to choose life, even when everyone expects you to choose duty. Even when choosing life might cost you everything. What would you have done in that moment, 22,000 feet above a target full of families? When duty demanded one choice, and conscience demanded another. When the weight of war pressed down on your shoulders, and the only witness to your decision was the darkness below. Think about that next time you face a choice between what's expected and what's right. Think about Jimmy Stewart's hand on that bomb release lever, and remember that sometimes the most important battles aren't fought against the enemy in front of you. Sometimes they're fought against the voice inside that tells you to follow orders, even when your heart knows there's a better way. Don't forget to hit that like button and subscribe to the channel if this story touched your heart. Thanks for listening.